Welcome to this episode of They're Driving Me Nuts, a podcast about those crazy making and soul sucking relationships and situations that all of us find ourselves in during our everyday modern lives. I am Dr. Linda Austin. I'm a practicing clinical psychiatrist. I'm a retired professor of psychiatry from the Medical University of South Carolina, and I was host of the public radio show What's on Your Mind for many years. We have a really interesting show today, and I'm calling it Male Friendships. So stay with me. Here's a letter I received at our website that you can access at www.they'redrivingmenuts. Dear Dr. Austin, my husband and I are in our late 60s, and we have had a long, stable, and loving relationship. Last year, I had a cancer diagnosis. I went through chemo and radiation. I'm now in remission. But the experience has made me think a lot about how my family would fare if I get sick again. I'm especially worried about my husband, as he seems totally dependent upon me for his emotional needs and his friendships. He does have some long-term good friends, but basically all they talk about is sports. I think he would like to have closer friends, but he just doesn't know how to go about doing that. Can you give me some advice? Signed, Eleanor. Well, Eleanor, what a great jumping off point for a very important topic. And do I have a treat for you? My guest is Dr. Geoff Greif. Dr. Greif is Distinguished University Professor at the University of Maryland School of Social Work. He's the author of more than 170 journal articles and book chapters and 15 books. And Dr. Greif, that is a truly awesome amount of scholarly contribution. I'm quite impressed. The book that he wrote that drew me to him to address this topic is called, great title, Buddy System, Understanding Male Friendships. Welcome to this podcast, Dr. Greif.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm so pleased. So, in your research and writing, I've noticed that you take on really big, fascinating topics of everyday modern life, often family life, often addressing our closest relationships. So, what was it that drew you in particular to the topic of male friendships? And then, how did you go about doing research for this topic?
Thank you again for having me on. I've always been interested in men in non-traditional roles. And when I was in my Master's of Social Work program at Penn, I did a master's thesis on men's consciousness raising groups. That was the time of women's consciousness raising groups. The feminist movement was in its full and wonderful bloom, and men like me and a number of my colleagues at the school were interested in exploring our own relationships with each other as well as with women. So I've been sort of dabbling or have been diving deeply into this area of men in traditional roles and men in non-traditional roles. When I was at Columbia doing my dissertation, I did it on custodial fathers, fathers who were raising their children alone after separation and divorce. So those were also men that were very rare at the time. Obviously, women usually get custody, and especially 35 years ago, 40 years ago, women would get custody almost always. So I thought, how do men who are doing this full time really manage their lives? And I also did a follow-up book on mothers without custody, because when you think of the family system, you have to think in this case of not only how the father got custody, but also why the mother does not have custody. And that has a lot of issues, again, related to women's roles, the stigma that women experience if they do not have custody, and the glorification, I should say, of men who have custody. These guys were getting a lot of praise for doing what I would consider, a fairly typical fathering role, but they were being glorified because they were doing it alone. And perhaps in many cases, that is a correct characterization. So that's how I got into the whole area generally.
And then when you started exploring this topic, tell us about your research methodology that is very much part and parcel of this book.
Yeah, over the course of a number of years, I was teaching a research course at the University of Maryland School of Social Work, and my MSW students would go out and interview typical normal men, not men in crisis, not men who are under a great deal of stress, but their friends. And they would go across the age span. I encourage them to interview people not just at their relatively young age, because students are usually young, but across the age span. And over the course of a few years, they did totally over a number of 350 interviews with men. So I was reading reams and reams of interviews with these guys and trying to get a sense of what's a typical men's relationship look like. I also had interviews with 130 women too, as a little bit of a comparison between how men maintain their friendships and how women do. So that's also an interesting topic about what are the differences here between men and women.
And we'll certainly talk about that. And you and I, when you and I were talking about this in preparation for this interview, we thought it was important to acknowledge that it's not really like men are from Mars and women are from Venus. We're all Earthlings, but there are two overlapping bell-shaped curves that describe male and female behavior. And so it's really interesting to kind of look at why those curves are not exactly identical. Did you come to the conclusion that there are really significant and important differences?
I think if we want to look at this sort of writ large, and it may not apply to any one man or woman who's hearing this, but sort of looking largely across groups of men and groups of women, I did find differences. I found differences, and this was not my terminology, but I certainly have used it to great effect, that men tend to construct shoulder to shoulder friendships, and women tend to construct face to face friendships. So, what I mean by this is that men get together with their friends and do things shoulder to shoulder. They'll get together and often play sports or watch sports. They need to have an activity where they are facing outward or doing something in relation to each other that is physical. Women tend to, again, it may not apply to any one woman or man listening to this podcast, women tend to feel more comfortable in face-to-face friendships, getting together with their friends, maybe over a cup of coffee, a glass of wine, just to talk and just to be together. So that tended to be borne out very much from the interviews. 80% of the men said that they got together with their friends and did sports or sports related things. That also goes to, well, what happens to men that are not into sports? And we could talk about that too. And women almost never talked about, and this was research done over a decade ago, almost tend to never talk about doing sports with their women friends, though I think that trend has changed. Women go out together and run or walk a lot more, I think, post-pandemic. But that was the case at this point. I think there's the residue of that now if we're looking largely at men versus women.
As I was thinking about this, the standard thing you hear is that women talk about their feelings. And I would say that to me, it feels more accurate to say that women talk endlessly about relationships. We use each other to metabolize the memories and the feelings and the hurts and the ups and the downs of so many aspects of our relationships and find it hugely satisfying to do so and almost anxiety provoking if there is no one around to talk about it. So I find myself wondering if men are not talking about relationships so much. How do you guys do that? How do you get by? Now, I know that you're in a field like my field, psychiatry, and I think that we're a whole different group of people. But how does a typical man get by without metabolizing those relationships ups and downs so much?
I think we do metabolize them. We do talk about our feelings. We may not just talk about it as much as women do, or we may not go into as great depth or speak about them as at great length as women might. And I don't know if that's a bad or a good thing. Sometimes men in relationships with women may escape to their friend's house to avoid being questioned about their feelings too. They may enjoy getting together. The old joke is, guy goes to his friend's house, they watch the football game, the guy comes back home, his wife said, so did Sam tell you about it, his divorce? And the guy says, no, that the topic never came up. So,
Yeah.
but I think to some extent, getting people or asking people to talk about their feelings can sometimes make a man feel uncomfortable. There's a little bit of trying to figure out how much vulnerability do I want to show. There's obviously vulnerability when you're talking about your feelings, unless you're sharing feelings of anger or rage, and that could be a vulnerable expression too, though it often is not read that way by the receiver of that kind of information. But for a man to be very open about his feelings and vulnerable with another man is something that we are not accustomed to doing. We're raised mostly by women, certainly in school. Majority of teachers, especially in the young grades, as we all know, are women. We grew up with kindergarten teachers and first through sixth grade teachers. Yeah, you might have a coach in middle school and high school and a science teacher or a great English or history teacher or math teacher, but there are going to be more women involved in interacting with males and females, obviously, than there are men in those roles. Our mothers may have been more engaged in talking to us about feelings, while our fathers were giving us other kinds of useful advice or interactions.
It is interesting as I was thinking about this that if I'm really honest with myself, there is a natural process that you go through as a parent, even as a mother, in getting your kids, teaching your kids to just tamp down those emotions. As a young mother and a young psychiatrist, I was big on saying, well, how does Goldilocks feel? How do the three bears feel? And teaching my kids the names of their emotions. And oh my goodness, by the time they got to be teenagers, it was like, I have heard enough of your feelings about this. Just be quiet and do what I'm telling you to do. And so, but you do have to get kids and actually, especially boys, because boys are so high energy and they're so rambunctious. And if you want to survive in a family with a bunch of kids, you do have to get them to just be quiet and listen up and dampen down their emotions.
Yeah, yeah. Having been the father of two daughters, though, I didn't have to deal with any of that.
I'm sure you have plenty to deal with, though.
Well, one turned out to be a psychologist and one turned out to be a social worker, so the apples didn't fall far from the tree.
Oh, that's really funny. That's great. You mentioned earlier your emphasis on the importance of looking at male relationships over the lifespan. Your research was not just on younger men. And in preparation for this, I have to say, I'm in Maine right now. We just got through Hurricane Lee, and I
Mhm.
had a bunch of friends come as hurricane evacuees, and we camped out
Mhm.
for 4 days during this period of time. And we spent a lot of time talking about our relationships and our sons' relationships and things that we had observed. And one of the things that we thought was that the younger men seemed to be much more open and engaged with their friends than their father's generation. And I'm wondering if your research found that out. And if so, is that a cohort effect? That is it that the whole generation is changing and they're always going to be more open, or do men tend to get more closed down over the course of a lifetime?
I don't know about the last point. We can come back to that. Do men get more closed down? I'd say the broad research says that men become more androgynous as they age. But to answer, I think the first part, the core question, since I wrote the book on men's friendships, I've written a book on adult sibling relationships, looking in depth at brothers and sisters over the age of 40. And I've looked in depth at in-law relationships. And certainly from the sibling data, there was a great differences between the men in their 40s and men in their 60s and 70s. Men in their 40s feel more comfortable playing a more central role emotionally in the family and with their sisters and each other than do the older men. So I think we're seeing, I agree with the premise that younger men are much more comfortable showing emotions than are their fathers or were their grandfathers, for example. I think that's just a great trend that we're seeing. Men are much more open. The Pew Research Center surveys say that people are not as afraid of gay people or being around people that are LGBT. They don't raise doesn't raise as many negative feelings in them as 20 or 30 years ago. So we're seeing a much greater level of interracial marriage, of LGBT issues, of interfaith marriage. There's a lot of things that are trending very, very well for men. And I also think, obviously, for women at the same time. But at the same time, men are not as comfortable as are women. So I think there's a really nice trend. We just are not in the same place at this point.
Yeah, it really is changing. I have 5 grandchildren, and two are brothers. And when they were maybe 7 and 9 years old, one of them, they call me Lolly. They said, "Lolly, what does this word homosexual mean?" And I said, I didn't know what they knew about this. I said, "Well, boys, sometimes a man loves a woman, but sometimes a man loves another man." And one of them said, "Oh, you mean like Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones? They're gay. Is that right? They're gay." And that was the end of the conversation. But it was
Right,
totally within their experience to be very comfortable with something that I knew nothing about till I was so much older.
right, right.
Um,
Great
uh,
trend. Yes.
um, you also actually opened this book with some really interesting historical background and I'd like to go more into the issue of the impact of homosexuality because at least in the 20th century and in the last 125 years, as you write, that has been a major sort of lurking anxiety in the backs of people's minds, as there's been so much stigma. But tell us about the vignette you told about Alexander Hamilton and the letter he wrote to Lawrence, and also Abraham Lincoln. I thought that was so fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. Two brief stories. The Alexander Hamilton letters have, been available, for ever since he wrote them, obviously, and they've been preserved. And some historians have looked at those letters and have found like great emotional expression. Dear Lawrence, I can't wait to be back in your arms again. I mean, that's the kind of thing that a man would never have written today, I don't think, but certainly would not have written, 20, 30, 40, 100 years ago that there was this great push against being gay in the early 20th century. There was the issue of, a real he-man. A real he-man is a man on the beach with his muscles, showing, and that's what masculinity was. There was some discussion about Abraham Lincoln sharing a bed with Joshua Speed when they were rooming together, and people were making a big deal of it. But obviously, when you only can afford one bed and it's cold and there's not central heating, that kind of thing became very normal for men to camp together to stay warm, and there was no sort of expectation that that was leading to a trend towards homosexual sex. So there's this whole history of looking at early men's roles that is often taken out of context, and we can talk about that from a cultural point of view too. That a lot of my research is on white men, but there also are men of color that are in my research studies too. And the understanding is that we have to be careful even what lens we're using to look at how men express emotions. Mediterranean men are much more physically expressive. You'll see them hugging and kissing each other, holding their hands when you're in Italy or Spain or around the Mediterranean. You go further north to Scandinavia, people tend to be more physically withdrawn from each other. So there are all these cultural variables that are lurking around. And finally, it may depend upon what a man saw growing up in his own family, how his father treated his friends, how his father treated his brother, his family, how much affection was talked about, how strangers were treated, how friendly was he, and obviously how friendly was a man's mother too. So there's a lot of sort of culture and history that goes into this friendship soup that needs to be considered.
Yeah, I'm reminded as you're talking, I read a biography of Queen Anne who had a very close relationship with, I think it was Lady Spencer, who ultimately um, was the first aristocrat to live in Blenheim Palace. And these letters were really kind of amazing. I mean, she talked about her passionate love for her friend, and she could hardly wait to hold her again. And I mean, it certainly did really look lesbian. I kind of doubt that it was. Queen Anne had 17 pregnancies, and I doubt that that was going on. But it does make you wonder then, do we, out of this anxiety about homosexuality, are we missing out on deeper, a deeper ability to really love and express our love for our friends?
Yeah, I think so. And also, one of the ways that it played out when I was doing the research is that a man moves to a new town or a new city and wants to make a friend. How does he do it? So if I move to Maine and I want to make a friend, I meet somebody and we have a nice chat, and I call him up the next week and say, "Do you want to come over to watch the football game?" Because we're not going to have an intimate face-to-face conversation. I'm going to try and do a shoulder-to-shoulder relationship with him, and he says, "No, Geoff, thanks for calling. To what extent am I going to pursue him for a friendship? Men don't like to look needy with each other, and if I keep on calling him up and he keeps on turning me down, um, what is going on for me? What is going on for him? And it's all my projection onto him, and that's why sometimes it's hard for men to pursue other men. I was socialized at a time where pursuing a woman for a date was kind of an in thing, part of the way that the scripts were written for young men, whereas pursuing a man for a friendship was not a script that we had in our head. And that's where I think some men are afraid to seem needy and vulnerable and seeking out a friendship from another man.
So going back to Eleanor's letter, raises the question of how do you how do you achieve greater closeness or greater, let's just say, a more mm, meaningful quality of relationship? And that gets to what is at the heart of what you call the buddy system, and we haven't talked about that yet. So let's talk about that, and then let's talk about how to move between those levels. Tell us about that.
Well, I found from the research that I was easily able to classify friendships into four fairly recognizable categories. And these are four categories of friendships. They are the must, the trust, the rust, and the just friendships. So a must friendship is somebody that I must call if something um, incredible happens to me. It could be the death of my spouse. It could be winning the lottery. Who am I going to call in the first few hours that I need to tell, or I need support from, or I want to have them share in the joy of this? So that's a relatively small circle of friends for a lot of people. But we have this fascinating larger group of people called trust friends if we're open to other people and open to friendships. These are the people maybe who were at your house over the last week during Hurricane Lee, who maybe are not your closest friends, but are people who you would certainly open up to and trust, and you really enjoy talking to them. but they're not sort of in that immediate inner circle. You see these people at parties all the time, and you have wonderful conversations, and you say, we need to get together more often, kind of thing, but you never do, or it takes you a year to get back to them. And we all need to be open to having those kinds of trust friends. They could be the person sitting next to you on the bus you have a very meaningful conversation to, and that becomes something that then gets spawned into, we'll drop each other an email from time to time. Rust friends can fall into other categories too, but rust meaning your old friends. I'm going to a funeral tomorrow for a classmate who died, and a bunch of my classmates from the class of 67 are going to get together. Those are my rust friends, and they will draw me back into what I was like when I was in high school, but they will also be themselves drawn into those roles. So often we fall back into roles. A rust friend can be a must friend, and that I think is something we can get into, that people feel they can't make new friends. They're only going to hold on to their old friends. And then there are your acquaintances who are just friends, people maybe at work who you see, you can chat with, maybe you'll grab lunch with, but you won't have them over to your house, but you see them and you can chat them up for just friends.
And it's wonderful to have all levels of those. I mean, they're
Yeah.
all important. They're all
Yes.
important.
Yeah.
So, in the last chapter of the buddy system, you give some wonderful advice that I think Eleanor might like to hear about how to help her husband strengthen his friendships. And you start off by saying that the number one thing is to begin by understanding yourself. So, what are the kinds of things that someone listening to this podcast who's thinking, gee, I really wish I had more friends. And incidentally, let me circle back, and there was, you gave a statistic in the book that 60% only 60% of men were satisfied with the numbers of friends they have, and the other 40% really felt like they were kind of missing out. So this is not a small group. But when you talk about the importance of starting off with understanding who you are as a predicate for building friendships, talk about that. What are the elements of that?
I think that's a pretty broad question, and I'm happy to take it on. Some of this is about going past just saying, I wish I had more friends. It's, I wish I had more friends, and I wonder what I can do. Am I interested in staying open to possibly changing myself, not totally redoing yourself, but maybe possibly changing myself in terms of, am I looking for friends? Am I being open to meeting new people? Am I thinking, do I believe that I can only be friends? And this goes back to the rust category, that I can only be friends with people who knew me when I was 17 or 18 or 20 because they're my lifelong friends? Or can I de novo from the beginning meet somebody tomorrow that I could be a friend with? Yes, they won't know me when I was the captain of the soccer team, but they may know me now as who I am. Part of building friendships is, what I learned from talking to other men is being able to read the other person, being open to the other person, and listening. Um, Men want friends that they can trust. They want people that have their back, and they want people that are supportive. So it's a matter of trying to gauge the person who you're meeting and being open to starting new friendships starting today. Women tend to be more concerned with helping their husbands make friends, by the way, than men are concerned with helping their wives make friends. So the letter makes total sense, that here you have a loving wife who's very interested and caring about her husband and wants to help him make friends. So it's a fairly typical letter expressing the typical concerns that many women have, that their husbands do not have enough friends.
It occurs to me also that in most couples I know, the woman is the social secretary and the man is kind of along for the ride. And I think what that reflects is that I'm speaking for myself, but I suspect this is true for a lot of women. We're very intentional about our friendships. So it's on my mind if I am thinking about someone, I might have the thought, hmm, they had us over for dinner 2 months ago. I haven't reciprocated yet. I need to do that. Or I'd really like to get closer to so and so. So I'm going to call her up and ask her to go out for a walk or have a cup of coffee. But it doesn't just happen. There is an intention, and I would say there's almost a plan in some way that goes through my mind. And it's got to be that way for most women. These dinner parties and things don't just happen by themselves. And I might say to men, if you want to have more friends, you got to have the intention of having more friends, and you have to have a plan, and you have to act on that plan, or else nothing's
You
going to
have to
happen.
reach out. You have to reach out. You have to be active. Friends don't come to you. You have to be open. You have to call the guy that you meet, and you have to get involved in activities that you enjoy, where you also might meet new people, be it going to a church group, a synagogue group, a mosque group. But you have to be open and looking around for, where's the book club, where's the biking or the walking club that is out there that I need to get myself into. Don't pick activities that you don't like just to meet friends. Pick activities that make you feel good about yourself, and be open to somebody subtly or covertly trying to be a friend with you. They may feel uncomfortable reaching out to you too.
You mentioned also that children can be a great opener for friendships, and you talk about the importance of fathers modeling by their friendship what their sons see, and those sorts of activities, going camping, for example. Although I would say that I think it's important for girls to be included in some of those things too. I remember as a child, I had an older brother and a father who's very active with my older brother, and an uncle with a son the same age. And I remember as a 4 and 5 year old watching them, all the guys go off, while I was home with my very sweet but kind of boring mother, and feeling very left out. So the
Well,
the
yeah,
role of the fathers is so important for kids to learn about friendships.
no, the roles are very important, especially, and I ran a fathering group for guys in prison for 5 years. And it's not just about fathers getting involved with their sons. It's about fathers are a role model for their daughters about who they want their daughter to partner with too. So we really emphasize that fathers are very important to sons, which is sort of like the common trope, but don't forget fathers are important to daughters in terms of how the father treats the mother, in terms of how the father respects them and listens to them.
But I think it's a great way also for men to make friendships is through their children, so that you don't have to sit through all those excruciatingly boring soccer games all by yourself, but you can actually have some fun and make some friends, and and
Yes.
and it's kind of a built-in social structure. There were so many very meaty paragraphs in your book, The Buddy System, but here's one that jumped out at me that had a number of things in it that caught my attention. You wrote, men have the capacity to form significant relationships late in life. And this reminds me of Eleanor's husband, but they usually choose not to. Trust is very important to men, and it is difficult to establish trust with new friends late in life when those men have other or competing friendships that go back many years. Men instinctively compare the new friendships with the old. New friendships lack the many fond memories related to youth that older friendships bring back. Although sticking with the familiar and comfortable is an understandable tendency, it closes men off to forming new friendships that may nourish and sustain them in the future. Are you impressed by your writing? It was beautifully written.
Thank you. Yeah. Again, it just goes back to the idea about being open to change. You're all our old friends are gonna become ill and not be able to travel. They're gonna move south, or they're gonna move north to Maine. They're gonna move south to Baltimore or Florida or wherever they go. And we're gonna have to adapt. Things change across the lifespan.
But hidden also within that paragraph, you talk about trust and the difficulty forming new friendships because of trust issues. And wouldn't it be a good thing not to worry so much about trust? I mean, just to say, what the heck? I'm just going to have fun. And, I mean, so what if this isn't my lifelong friend or so, let's just dive in.
Right. Let's just start now where we are and have a good time. Don't hold up a new friendship to an imaginary or a real standard established by, your best friend from the past.
Yeah. You wrote that some of the major men's organizations like Masons, Elks, and Knights of Columbus have diminished over time. Do you know why that is?
I think that men don't tend to get together in relations because they're being pulled into the family much more.
Mm,
That you can't have a man's night out anymore like you could 50 years ago. If you are married to a woman or if you're married to another man, you are going to be having that woman or that man also in the workforce, and you're going to be having to come home and do stuff with the kids that maybe your father didn't have to do. So men don't have the freedom, to freedom in quotes, of course, to leave behind the wife and kids and go out and socialize with their friends, because their wives are working also and are going to say, no, I'm going to go out with my friends too, and we need to balance this. So the ability to join outside clubs is not as available because of the fabulous increase of women in the workforce. It also has changed that men feel more comfortable around women in the workforce. My father never had to deal with a woman at his level. He had a secretary. I, of course, have a dean who's a woman. I've had other bosses that are women. I've had bosses that are people of color. It's a lot of experiences that white people did not have growing up, and white men especially did not have experiences with women who were their peers or their bosses. So it levels the playing field, and it brings in the issue of course I'm not going to go out and leave my wife to take care of the kids, because I've just heard my colleague in the next office say, she has to rush home and take care of the kids, and I don't want that to befall my wife or my husband.
so, Geoff, let's finish up by really thinking hard and cleverly about answering Eleanor's letter. I like I really like to have this podcast offer some practical strategies for these everyday problems. And just in thinking about practical strategies, when I read that about, the Masons and so forth not being so active, I thought, well, so what can you do instead? You can form a small group, a men's luncheon group, or a book club. We actually, during the pandemic, my husband and I formed a film club with friends who were far away, and we watch a movie separately in our homes once a month. And then the whole group, there are about 14 of us, come together and talk about the movie once a month. And um, it occurs to me that those small groups or luncheon groups, or I don't know, maybe you can think of some more, can kind of bridge that awkwardness that older men feel about reaching out and being close if there are three or four of you together. Do you have
Yeah,
thoughts?
the Elks groups, of course, appeal to men across the age span. We're talking now for this guy in his 60s. I would advise the letter writer to sit down with him and be straightforward and say, this cancer scare I've had has brought up a lot of feelings in me about my own vulnerability, but also about your own vulnerability. And I'm concerned about your ability to make friends and what might happen to you. Can you help me with this feeling, with this reaction? And depending upon his response, are there some concrete things that we can do? Should we start going out as a couple with other friends and sort of ease into that if they don't have enough couple friends? Are there other activities now that you have free time and I'm well enough to take care of myself at home, where sure, go out for an hour or two a day and see what's up. But I think dealing with it up front is a good role model for how you want him to then deal with his own friendships. So you're modeling transparent communication metaphorically for him on a different level with his own friends without making him feel uncomfortable that he's being sort of pushed into a feelings zone where he doesn't feel necessarily as comfortable as you want him to feel.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I wonder also about if making new friends feels formidable, reaching into down those levels, reaching back to rust friends or just friends and seeing if you can move them up a notch or two. There was this one cute paragraph that you wrote where a man said, and I have heard men say this. I think my father used to say this, oh, I haven't talked to my best friend for a decade, but when we get together, we just pick right up where we were. And then it begs the question, well, why the heck haven't you talked to him for a decade?
Well, he didn't call me and I didn't call him, and I'm not going to be the first one to call him. Right.
Right. Right.
Yeah. No, it is. I did find out in the research that it is not uncommon for men to pick up where they dropped off 5 or 10 years before, whereas women seem to need to have more constant interaction. Men don't feel discomfort in great gaps in time.
Well, I have so enjoyed our talk today, and I want to close out with a quote that you ended the buddy system with, which is great. You wrote, "And when thinking about your own future as a friend, consider Rick's optimistic statement to the police chief, Captain Louis Renault, in the 1942 movie Casablanca, which actually our film club watched, as they stroll off into the fog, having just thwarted the Nazis, and after each has just seen the other as an adversary. Quote, Louis, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship." So thanks a million. I'm glad to have you as a new friend. And I want to highly recommend your book, The Buddy System, Understanding Male Friendships by Geoff Greif, Greif. And I want to thank my listeners for joining us for this episode of They're Driving Me Nuts. If you want to learn more about Dr. Greif or access other podcasts, my website address is www.they'redrivingmenuts. If you're listening on your favorite podcast platform, I'd be so thrilled if you would leave me a review, as long as you say nice things, that is. Please do join me again next week. In the meantime, remember to look for the fun in dysfunctional, and please don't let them drive you nuts.